My name is James and I paint minis. This is Spoon37 Minis. Right, so you haven't seen many uploads during the lockdown. I just wanted to explain what has happened. Essentially, like, I haven't been ill, I haven't had the coronavirus as far as I know. I've just been super unmotivated to work on my miniatures, so there haven't been any videos because I haven't been painting the minis. What I have been doing though, what I noticed was on Instagram, people were also unmotivated, and so a lot of people started posting like challenges and contests and that sort of thing. So whilst I haven't worked on my normal minis, I've actually worked on a series of little, individual minis for challenges or contests, and I've also entered a terrain contest now. I'm just starting the third, I think it is, might be the fourth, but I certainly did one in March and then April and then May, and so yes, I've done three, and that'll be four. So I've actually done quite a lot of modelling, quite a lot of work, and I just wanted to show you what I've been working on during that time. Okay, so I pulled these pictures off my phone to get them onto the PC to show you the kind of things that I've been working on. I'm not going to show you all of these pictures because there's nearly 1,000, but I've edited a choice few just to show you the things I've been working on. Okay, so we're going to start off with the first contest I entered. This is a terrain building contest run by Encounter Terrain on Instagram. The theme for March was defense. So, as you can see, here's my starting picture with the materials I started with. And to give you some idea of how small 10 by 10 centimeters is, here's a Goliath standing on a 10 by 10 centimeter piece of cardboard. Now, as I'm prone to doing, I actually built this out of fairly sturdy materials, so I've actually got some offcuts of wood that I drilled, screwed and glued together in order to make a base before I actually started working on the sort of modelling parts like these tiles. And the idea was to simulate a sort of ruined imperial garrison after a Tyranid invasion, where there would be a large Tyranid creature defending some eggs. That was my idea for defence. I've included a Primaris Space Marine for scale. Obviously he wasn't part of the final diorama, just to give you some idea of how big the Tyranid creature or tentacle or whatever you want to call it actually is. Now, I had to learn various techniques and make up a lot of things on the fly, such as making eggs out of foil, using interior filler, bits of wire, pipe cleaners for some of the tentacles, which is actually a technique showed to you by the contest organiser. He normally makes armature trees out of them, but I actually use them for tentacles for a large Tyranid creature. And then obviously once all this was made, I started painting it in my usual fashion, but because you only got 2 weeks to do it in, I really had to kind of rush to get this done. Normally I'd take, a month to paint a miniature. Here I had to do the whole thing, construction and painting, inside of 2 weeks. Now, as my first attempt, this was quite an ambitious project. It was quite large, there were a lot of materials used, and just getting things like primer all over it took a tremendously long time. So I might have bitten off slightly more than I could chew, but I did actually manage to complete it all within the deadline. Now, if you've watched my videos about painting my Tyranid Hive Tyrant, you might start to recognise some of the colours as Hive Fleet Behemoth. I painted most of these in exactly the same way. I did have to cut some corners though, so it's arguably not to the same high standard you'll particularly notice on the red flesh. It's kind of lacking compared to my Tyranid army. But I have thrown in a picture of a Tyranid warrior next to the terrain, so you can see why the sort of blue ash terrain works, because it would be the same as my actual Tyranid army. So that's coming up next. So you see how the terrain matches there, and kind of the fence part matches a little bit, even though I had much more time to work on the miniature than I did on the terrain piece. And then this is one of the final pictures that was submitted for judging. Now, during this time I did not actually shoot very much video, unfortunately, but what I did was, with each thing that I completed, I did usually try to shoot it on my little turntable. Unfortunately, this one is so big that I had to shoot the bottom half on the turntable rotating, and then change the camera position and shoot the top half. So there's actually two little videos that go with it, so you can see all of the details inside and out on my very first terrain project in, I don't know, 20 years or so. Now, in terms of contest results, this didn't win anything at all, but people were quite impressed, and I felt it was a good first attempt at something, particularly as I didn't exactly have a reputation for making terrain. So I felt personally I did quite well on this. Obviously there were at the time, I think, 29 other entrants, so I was always going to have a slim chance of winning. Now, this was followed by a very small challenge by On Darkened Wings on Instagram, who offered up, I think it was a £10 Games Workshop voucher to paint something not normally considered a tabletop miniature. So I had this cheeky chappy that I got with a Christmas cracker of all things, which is a sort of bath toy wind-up thing, and instead of painting it as it is, like a little orange lobster, I painted it with mini paints to look like a sort of chibi Cthulhu type of thing. Again, this one amused a lot of people. I had to get it done inside of a week though, that was the only thing. As I say, I'm normally a slow painter, so I had to carefully build up the layers of paints as quickly as was reasonably possible. The main colour was Dark Angel's green, and just to prove it, there's a Dark Angel right next to this wind-up toy. Bit by bit I added all these freehand markings. Originally I wasn't going to do this, but I just decided, why not? You know, I had time before the deadline, and of course Cthulhu sleeps or lies in his house dreaming, so I added the Zs for Cthulhu sleeping. I didn't shoot any video of this one, unfortunately. Around the same time, there was a one colour challenge run by, at the time, the Warhammer Lass, now called Lass Hammer on Instagram, and I was nominated to paint the colour purple, and I found a 4th edition skink archer from Warhammer, which, as you can see, is painted up almost like a statue as standard. And I broke it down, built up the base a little bit, and then proceeded to paint it with, I think, a reasonable array of purple colours, as you will see. Now, this was a fun little challenge because it really makes you think. You were allowed to use black and white for highlighting and shading, but you were only allowed, other than that, to use the colours that were called purple. I did stretch the definition a bit by using things like Grimoire Purple from the Honor Painter, Purple Ink, which is a very old Games Workshop product that they no longer make, and things like that. But even so, all of the colours I used were purples of some description. As you can see, the skink is rather small when compared with the Primaris Marine. Interestingly, the more modern skinks are actually quite a bit bigger than this one. Now again, this was a very short challenge. I think there were 7 days to do it in. I actually completed it in about 4 because I reached the point where I was just like, well, I could work on it a lot more, or I could just kind of draw a line under it here. So in the end, that's what I did because I was quite happy with it. But as you can see, I've built up some shading and highlighting just using various purples. Even though some of them border on the pink, they still have purple in the name, so I went with them, including colouring a grass tuft, which I've never done before. That's actually purple ink, and then it's been dry brushed with the Army Painter Warlock Purple, which is actually magenta, but close enough. And there you go, that's pretty much the scheme done. I did take a picture of it next to other models that I painted at the time, so that's a test model for an Emperor's Children colour scheme, which I'm not super happy with the armour colours, but other than that it was pretty good. And here's one of the final pictures I submitted. Again, this wasn't a contest, so it didn't win anything, it was just something fun to do. I even painted the edges of the base purple. Now, shortly after this, I managed to get hold of some Winsor & Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable brushes, which several people on social media will tell you are the best of the best of the best, unless they're using a similar manufacturer, which they will say that one's the best. But as you can see, they have a very, very fine point. That's, I believe, a size 2 brush, and it has an incredibly fine point. And I was able to do some incredibly fine freehand on the Chaos test model, which I was quite impressed by, but it actually made my own efforts look kind of clumsy, because the brush tip is so fine, and I'm not really used to having brushes this fine, that it actually made my freehand efforts look kind of bad. So I realised there's a lot of room for improvement on this particular model. In addition, I decided just to draw a line under this one and do the base, some Vallejo Dark Earth texture, an orc skull from the Games Workshop Skulls pack, and then that all got painted up, which currently matches my other Chaos models, but I haven't painted many of them with this base, so that'll get better over time. Now, another terrain contest, same organiser, but this time the theme was Sacred Place. I had about 6 days to plan this one, and the idea I eventually settled on was a sacred place, which, as we were all under lockdown at the time, I felt was particularly poignant for us hobbyists. I actually decided to make a hobby shop, of all things. Admittedly a fantasy hobby shop run by a goblin with a Space Marine customer, but a hobby shop nonetheless, and I think it actually struck a chord with a lot of people in the contest. So this one, although it has, as you can see, quite humble beginnings, actually ended up winning not only the contest overall, but it actually won what's called the Crafter's Choice Award, which is chosen by the other entrants of the contest, which was very humbling. And if I had to choose a prize to win, I think that would be the one, because it's chosen by people who are actually in the contest making these dioramas themselves. Now, none of the techniques used here is particularly groundbreaking. As you can see, I'm making micro terrain for a gaming table in the fashion they used to in Games Workshop guides in the 90s. I'm making a lot of the furniture out of bits of plywood and balsa wood. PVA glue is used throughout, but because I consider myself more of a painter rather than a crafter, I actually deliberately made this one more about freehand painting. So as you see, I gradually turned these relatively boring looking objects into actual, like these boxes turn very quickly into boxed games and boxes of miniatures and so on. In this fantasy hobby shop, which allowed me to have a lot of fun with things like brand names and fun signs and so on. I even carved some little paintbrushes out of balsa wood, believe it or not, painted them up to look like the old Games Workshop brushes with the red handles and the brown bristles. And so here's my shop owner with his custom paper t-shirt and a Space Marine customer with his leaflet rolled up in his hand, which is how he found out about the shop in the first place. And then this is the layout of the shop unpainted. Now, the paint did take a while on this one. Obviously things like the floorboards and desk and what have you were easy, but the freehand painting, actually started to test my brush capability. Obviously these initial ones where you can see the lettering were done with an ordinary brush. I actually tidied them up afterwards with my new Winsor & Newton brushes to paint, if you like, the black at the edges of the letters, so the letters got more defined by painting around them rather than painting them precisely in the first place, which might sound a bit backwards, but it worked for me. Oh, and anyone who says I can't paint ultramarines, look at these pictures. Bearing in mind this was done over a couple of days, and I couldn't do like full highlighting like I normally would, I still think this is fairly good going. This is one of the brands I had fun with, a bit of a nod to Kenny Boucher, aka Next Level Paint, on Twitch and YouTube. So I had my paint rack decked out saying Next Level Paint. And then these were all the bits ready to go on the model. And then this was one of the photos I submitted to the judges showing pretty much the whole model. You can't see a corner of the gaming table, but you get the idea. All the stuff's laid out as it would be in a hobby store with various signs. And then we've got our rotational video. Unfortunately the white balance is a little off on this, so if it has a ever such slight sort of reddish magenta cast, that's actually my fault for not setting up the camera properly. Now this was another brief challenge by the Warhammer Lass, now known as @LassHammer on Instagram, to paint something either showing age or beauty. I was chosen for beauty, and I had actually previously won some Stormcast Eternals in a little contest, so I decided to try my hand at non-metallic metals. Now this won't be the best example you've ever seen of non-metallic metals because it is literally my very first attempt. So I split it into sub-assemblies. I started, putting primer on and base coating as I normally would, but then I started watching a lot of videos about, easy ways to do non-metallic metals, how to do gold non-metallic metal armor. Initially I dry brushed this, which actually has absolutely nothing at all to do with the final effect of the non-metallic metal armor. It just gave me something to look at fairly quickly that would show kind of vague highlights and dark areas. Now this is the beginning where you can see I've started to work in a kind of first highlight on the armor, and the base is fairly standard here, just did it nice and light. So it was the same idea, I just wanted everything to look clean and bright, and so like even the leaves are like spring leaves rather than autumn leaves. And then I'm hoping you can see on this shield like how I started to build up the light and dark areas for the non-metallic metals, even though this is at an early stage. Now, amazingly, this was built up with surprisingly dark colours. I believe the brown was Mornfrang Brown from the Games Workshop, and the yellow was Avalanche Sunset, which is a base colour, and I just mixed them in different proportions to get the lighter and lighter and lighter shades. And then I think I used Moon Dust Yellow from the Army Painter as just a very peak highlight in the centre of the pure yellow, so that you'd have an even sharper contrast as it went along, so it generally gets brighter and brighter and brighter as it goes along from an imagined light source. Now again, as this came together, you can see this isn't a terrible attempt at non-metallic metals, but it is literally my first. I dare say there are mistakes all over the place, but to do this inside of a week for an age versus beauty challenge and just have a go, particularly as I just basically finished that hobby shop and then had just a few days to knock this out. Oh, and if you've ever wondered why there are so many conversions between Stormcast Eternals and Primaris Marines, they are literally the same size. Right, and then this is the finished model. That's one of the better shots I got against a white background, and you can see, I mean, it is a bit rough around the edges, but as a first attempt at non-metallic metals, I think it was actually quite good. It's definitely something I need to practice and get better at, and of course for the majority of the models I'm painting at the moment I'm not really using a non-metallic metal effect, so it's something that I will probably have to paint at least the other two Stormcast Eternals to get used to. Now after that, Ian Grace, otherwise known as the Imperial Brothers on Instagram, was running an object source lighting contest, which I initially thought I wouldn't have time to enter at all, and then he extended the deadline by a week or so, and that actually gave me the time to have a go at it because I'd done these other things. And of course I know he wanted me to enter, but of course I was like, well, you know, I've done 2 challenges and a contest, you know, I'm kind of burnt out and I haven't had time, and this gave me a solid week to just focus on one mini with an object source lighting effect. Now, as you can see, this is a moderate conversion of Lord of the Rings Ranger of Arnor. I've added a bit of wire for the bowstring. He was missing a sword, so I converted it to a flaming brand. And the idea is he's just walked into a narrow cave and the brand is lighting up the surface and he's just seen something, you know, moving in the shadows or something like that. So he's kind of alert but not actually fighting. I haven't done much in the way of object source lighting before. I've done literally like a couple of plasma guns. You'll see like in the intros where I have my Juggernaut of Khorne, I've done the plasma gun there, and actually it's hard to see, but on the base there are some orange lighted bits from the belly of the Juggernaut as well. And then for this one it's a really heavy object source lighting effect, so what I did was I dry brushed the whole thing in shades of grey up to an off-white, and then I glazed in very thin colours over it and gradually built that up, so you can see it starts really pasty, really pale, and then the vibrancy gradually gets built up and up and up. Now this isn't normally my style of painting, but it let me have some fun with lighting effects, pre-shading, glazing, that sort of things that I don't normally do in order to try and help me improve as a painter and a hobbyist more generally, because of course even conversion is something that I don't do a lot of. Now of course to match the miniature I had to do a lot of lighting effect on the base. I kept it mostly black simply because it was meant to be, you know, like inside a cave at night. The outside of the cave I don't think I've shown on the pictures, but I did paint like lighter greys and dry brush it with a sort of bone colour over the top. I also shaded his foot that would be in the mouth of the cave entrance as if it were dimly lit by, say, like moonlight. And then as you see the torch lines up with a light spot on the wall, the lit rock and the lit side of the mushroom and so on and so forth. And then in order to take pictures of these that would actually show this without being kind of blown out like this picture, I actually had to dig out a bit of a dark background to take it against. So I've never done that before, but again, another first, so there you go, that was that challenge completed. It didn't win, by the way. Now, before I knew it, it was May, and all of the various challenges sort of calmed down a bit, but I was still doing the terrain contest for Encounter Terrain, and the theme this time was Trap. And you know how it is when you're chatting with friends and somebody makes a throwaway comment, oh, what about a wedding? Well, okay, let's make a fantasy wedding then. So that's exactly what I did. This was quite a fun project, but it did involve painting and converting a lot of miniatures. Now the actual crafting aspects of this were comparatively simple, as you can see, cork steps, some Vallejo Dark Earth pumice, but the real work went into the miniatures, which may have been a mistake because I've since discovered that the judging doesn't count miniatures very highly. It's more to do with crafting of the terrain because it is a terrain contest, but be that as it may, I still think I made a good hash of this and may have stood a chance of winning all the same. Now, as in the last build, I went for a bit of a comedic angle. So here I've done a skeleton sitting down because presumably he's been sitting there so long he's actually died of boredom or something. And then we've got the cake and the cake topper, which actually is a epic orc holding up an Eldar Harlequin by the ankle, which I've converted to look like the bride and groom. And then here we see a bit of the heavy conversion work. This is the beginning, so that orc is actually going to be the bride with the bouquet of flowers and eventually a dress. But even just converting many of the other miniatures to look like they're not in a compact pose and they're just sitting down was actually quite difficult. Oh, and also I made a tiny ring box and a tiny little copper ring out of some 24 gauge copper wire and a cocktail stick. Now I had ordered a Tech Priest engine seer to act as the priest, but it wasn't arriving anytime soon, so I substituted in an Eldar Warlock, which was simply missing its hands and weapons, so a couple of Eldar Guardians' hands and a made up book solved that one. This is the orc's dress made out of green stuff, which is probably terrible green stuff work, but I was doing my best. I don't normally do conversions this heavy, as you can see on the groom. The original model is on the right, the groom converted is on the left. Now, because the terrain elements were fairly simple, they actually went together fairly easily. So before I knew it, I was actually having to paint things, such as the base. This is right after applying wash to the ground. Eventually, of course, it's got dry brushed, and the steps got washed and dry brushed and so on. And then, of course, I found I had to paint 10 models in 7 days. Now, as I've said before, I'm a slow painter. So if you're a speed painter, that probably sounds like, wow, that's super easy. But normally I take like about a month to paint a model. Now I had to paint 10 models in 7 days, so it took a while. Now, this was also my first time using static grass. Again, I watched YouTube videos on how to do this, and so I applied watered down PVA glue and then a homemade shaker, and after it was dried, this is what it looked like, which I actually think is quite good for a first attempt. It may not be the best attempt at static grass you've ever seen, but for me, I was pretty pleased with it. Now, this is the wedding scene part assembled. The cake was cardboard covered in filler and then sanded top and bottom. And then these are the models partway through being painted. Again, I found a lot of shortcuts for doing the various armours and skin tones and so on. The groom did take a little extra time, so did the bride, unfortunately, but those two really had to be right. As you can see, I painted the Eldar priest to look like he was from Biltan. Biltan having been destroyed, maybe he's looking for work. Oh, and this was interesting. This arch, I found pictures of arches online that had a sheet going through them. So this is a quarter of a Kleenex tissue folded through the arch. And I actually think it looks quite appropriate. And I started to assemble it, and as you can see, it started to go together quite well. Here's the groom and the best man, both looking a little bit nervous. But I did the best I could. And then the bride with custom painted dress, custom made veil out of tracing paper and freehand paint. And then I added some little flowers on top with a bit of embroidery thread as well, so they actually aren't glued in place. And finally, this is one of the submitted pictures. You can't actually see the detail in the veil, so I took other pictures to show that. But there were lots of pictures submitted for the judges, and here's the scene rotating. Again, one of the few videos I shot during this era. Now, whilst a lot of people liked this, it didn't actually win the contest, but having seen that there were nearly 60 or so entries this time round, and there was such a high quality of them, I'm not actually ashamed in the slightest. So the winners were actually fantastic, and I feel no shame in, if you like, not beating them. And finally, a little sneak peek of what I've been working on for Dreams Contest. I still don't know how this one has fared because they haven't done the winner stream yet at the time of making this video. Right, if you watched this far, first of all, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you can get notifications about future videos. I hope they will be coming out soon.